All right, so we're going to watch this video, and I am going to stop it at certain points and uh, add some stuff or elaborate on on certain things. But you're looking at this is chapter four of the chapter seven of the American Pageant, and this is the time period between, or really during the French and Indian War, and then what happens as a result of that. Really, what we want to focus on with the French and Indian War is how it affects the relationship between the American colonies and the British Empire. And so he's going to talk a lot about that, and I will elaborate some.
History, people. Today we're taking a look at a very important topic, the road to the American Revolution, what really happened between 1763 and 1775 when fighting breaks out. Now, keep in mind, 1763 is a huge turning point. England gets a major expansion of its territory by defeating France, but it comes at a great cost. Quick rundown. Remember the end of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. England's in debt. Solitary neglect comes to an end. They're not going to have a hands-off approach to the colonies. They need to deal with that debt. Pontiac's rebellion causes a lot of concern for England because they have to use their military to crush that native resistance, and they want to prevent colonists from moving west, so they issue the Proclamation Act of 1763, really the first of a series of acts that England's going to impose on the colonies. All sorts of things are happening following the end of the French and Indian War. In fact, you get the two Georges, King George III and his Prime Minister, George Grenville, over there on the right, advocated for acts to increase revenue and to consolidate colonial control.
All right, real quick. So the end of the French and Indian War, first of all, the colonists, their belief was we didn't need the help of the British military. We didn't need their help at all because we were the ones that really pushed back against the French and their Indian allies. We're the ones that fought in the trenches and did most of the heavy lifting during this war. So they were really pointless. The British, on the other hand, were saying, "Hey, without us, you wouldn't have won, and we've spent a lot of money and a lot of time over here. So we need you to start fitting the bill a little bit to pay for some of the cost of this war." And obviously, the colonies are like, "Hey, we've never had to pay these taxes, and we're not going to start now. We didn't need your help anyway, so why should we have to pay for something where you didn't even really contribute that much?" Now, the end of salutary neglect, obviously, it ends in 1763. That's also the end of the French and Indian War, but it's not the end of the war itself that causes the end of salutary neglect. It is the Proclamation Act of 1763 that ends salutary neglect. This essentially said, the British Empire said, colonists will not be allowed to settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains to the west. And colonists were like, whoa, you do not have that power. You do not have that authority. Number one, you can't enforce it. Number two, it's our God-given right to go west and go and settle where we want to. So this was really the end of the policy of salutary neglect. Literally, the British government came and put the hammer down on the colonists at that point, and the colonists were not having any of it.
No more solitary neglect. So what do we mean by consolidating imperial control? Well, you get the Sugar Act in 1764. It's passed on sugar to raise revenue. This is the first act intended to raise revenue. And remember, there were other acts previously, like the Molasses Act of 1733, which the colonists oftentimes ignored or evaded. So along with the Sugar Act, you get the British stricter enforcement of the Navigation Acts, which were being completely ignored, and there's a crackdown on the colonies. You're not going to be smuggling like you were. In fact, violators would be tried in vice admiralty courts, and these courts really caused a lot of anger in the colonies because the crown appointed the judges, and there was no juries. So you get a lot of colonial opposition early on, not only to the Proclamation of 1763, but to the Sugar Act and to old acts being more strictly enforced. You also get the Quartering Act in 1765, which colonists were required to provide food and housing for British soldiers. In the minds of England, this was only fair. These soldiers are over in North America protecting these colonies, and so therefore they're going to have to pay their fair share. This also causes anger in the colonies. But the big one, the one you better know about, is the Stamp Act in 1765. This placed a tax. It's the first direct tax, meaning the tax is collected from those who use the good. And it placed a tax on a variety of legal documents and items, everything from newspapers to advertisements to pamphlets to legal documents. Anybody using any of those items had to pay this stamp tax. This really angered the colonial elite, the wealthy especially, in the middle class and the commercial class, because they're the ones producing these items. And so you get a lot of opposition from the Stamp Act.
All right, real quick, the Sugar Act, the American colonists opposed this, but they weren't just foaming at the mouth, outraged over it, because this was a tax that they could avoid. They didn't have to pay this because they didn't have to buy the goods that were being taxed here. So it wasn't something that where they said, okay, now it's time to fight back. Obviously, they protested and they weren't happy about it, but they weren't they didn't lose their minds over it. The Quartering Act, they did not like this at all. So this kind of just builds upon the Sugar Act. But then you get to the Stamp Act. This is a direct tax. This is a tax on legal documents, a tax on paper products. This is one that could not be avoided by the colonists. Now, this is a tax, to be fair, that had been in place in England for a long time, and the colonists hadn't been paying it. So, a lot of people in England were like, why aren't they paying this tax, especially since we just fought this war? Let's let them pay this tax too. They're British citizens. They enjoy the same rights and liberties and protections of the British Empire. So they should be able to pay. They should be forced to pay this as well. And again, here we go. The colonists were not having any of it.
And one of the big arguments from the colonists was this was passed without consent of the colonial legislators.
All right. So in other words, the argument was, in England, we've been paying this tax. They need to help pay for the cost of that war. Well, the argument in the colonies were, we do not have representation in Parliament. We don't have anybody that will stand up for our point of view in Parliament. We don't get to elect someone to go to Parliament and fight for us. So we shouldn't have to pay this tax because we didn't have a say in whether it was passed or how it would look.
Remember, different colonies like Virginia have the House of Burgess. The colonies say, we didn't vote for these taxes, therefore we're being taxed without proper representation. And you get a whole bunch of colonial responses to the Stamp Act. For example, in the House of Burgess, Patrick Henry, a very kind of influential colonial leader, issues something called the Virginia Resolves. And in it, he reiterates the no taxation without representation. He talks about only the colonial legislator could tax the colonies. He's heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas coming over from Europe, and they're accustomed to a tradition of self-rule. The colonies have been kind of doing their own thing for a very long time. Now, England responds to these charges with something very important called virtual representation. And they basically say, you are British citizens, colonists, therefore you are represented by Parliament, and the colonists don't buy it. You have other responses. You have the Stamp Act Congress. This meets in New York, and representatives from 9 colonies meet to oppose British policies, especially the Stamp Act. This is a move towards intercolonial unity. The colonies are meeting, they're working together, and this is the first organized resistance amongst the colonies to British policy. Now, it's important to keep in mind, intercolonial disunity remained. Organizations, secret societies like the Sons of Liberty and also the Daughters of Liberty formed. The Sons of Liberty were a more radical group because of their attacks on royal officials, their tarring and feathering that was used to harass tax collectors. But they were very influential in organizing the boycotts. Various colonists were issuing non-importation agreements. You could see a list of people who violated those agreements against British imports, and this was the most effective form of resistance to British policies. There's a huge drop in trade. In fact, many British merchants over in England are demanding Parliament repeal the Stamp Act because they were losing tons of money.
That is an extremely important point. The most effective form of protest against the Stamp Act and other forms of taxation that the colonies did not like, the most effective form of protest was boycotts. They boycotted British imports, non-importation agreements. The reason this was most effective is because it made people in England, merchants in England, it forced them to go to Parliament and fight on behalf of the colonists. They said, hey, even though initially we did want this tax on the colonies, now we don't. We don't want them to be taxed because they're not buying our stuff now. And if we get this Stamp Act removed, maybe they'll start buying our stuff again. And by the way, the Stamp Act will be removed, and it will be removed before a single penny is paid in as a result of that tax being passed. So really, the tax is passed, but it is not implemented. And by the time it's going to be implemented, it's already been repealed because of the effectiveness of these boycotts.
As a result of these boycotts, this is a grassroots movement. You have a variety of people in colonial society taking part in it. It's not just the colonial elite. And as a result of this failure to actually generate revenue for the crown, Parliament voted to repeal the Stamp Act. It wasn't raising the money, so you might as well repeal the darn thing. But you still have that dilemma. You still need to pay off the debt from the French and Indian or the 7 Years' War. After the Stamp Act was repealed...
By the way, the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War are the same thing. In America, they called it the French and Indian War. In England, they called it the 7 Years' War.
Parliament does pass something called the Declaratory Act in 1766, and it basically is saying to the colonies, we still have the power, we still have the authority over you, we could still tax you, so don't get all giddy and happy and things of that nature. They still need to raise revenue, they still need to find a way to get that coin, get that money, and Charles Townshend becomes the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically the money guy, and he proposed his own revenue plan. This is, of course, named after him, the Townshend Act, which puts a tax on imports such as paper, tea, glass, and other items. This created a lot of controversy because the money raised by the acts would be used to pay royal officials in the colonies. Previously, their salaries were paid by the colonial assemblies. And if you're a colonist, you feel like if they're getting paid by officials in England, they're going to rule in favor of the English.
All right, real quick. Declaratory Act is issued after the Stamp Act is repealed. So England repeals the Stamp Act and they say, oh, but wait a minute. We want to make sure that you know that we're doing this because we think it's good policy. We're not doing it because we're afraid of you colonists, you rebels with pitchforks. So they pass the Declaratory Act that essentially says we have power over you. So we're taking back the Stamp Act, not because we're cowering in fear. We're doing it because it's good policy. And we also want you to know that we can enact any laws that we want, and you can't really do anything about it. So that's what the Declaratory Act was. The Townshend Acts, tax on imports such as paper, tea, and glass. It is important to note that these will be used to pay royal officials in the colonies. So England will now pay these royal officials, whereas in the past, the colonies had paid royal officials. So if you're being paid by England, you're more than likely going to do things that England wants you to do rather than what the colonies want you to do. So that's one of the things that the colonies had an issue with regards to this.
Versus the colonists' interests. You have, once again, tension mounting. Another part that really angered people, did this kind of like shock to a lot of colonists, the British could search private homes for goods by getting a writ of assistance. Rather than having to get a warrant, they could search for smuggled or illegal goods with just a simple writ of assistance. And as you could see, shock spread amongst the colonists.
Yes, make sure you know what a writ of assistance is.
There was resistance to the Townshend Acts, not to the same degree as the Stamp Act, since this was an indirect tax paid by merchants. There's not a huge widespread resistance, but there is still some. Really important to know is John Dickinson writes Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. In his writing, he talks about that these taxes are against English law and that colonists as British subjects have rights as individuals. He uses a lot of the ideas coming over from the Enlightenment to once again denounce the taxes imposed by Parliament. Of course, England argues that the colonists are represented with virtual representation, but this does not quiet the anger amongst many colonists.
What virtual representation essentially meant was that England was saying, no, you are represented because Parliament has the best interest of all English citizens in mind. So the decisions that Parliament makes or that the King makes, we're doing it for the benefit of all British citizens. So even though you don't have a direct, real voice in Parliament, don't worry. We're going to take care of you, and we're going to make sure that we're doing what's best for you, whether you have a direct say or not. So that's virtual representation, and obviously that is complete garbage. Um, One of the things that I did not mention at the beginning of this that I want to make sure you'll need to go back and look at this is I want you to pay attention to the types of resistance that the colonies engaged in. I want you to pay attention to what kinds of violent or destructive forms of resistance they engaged in, and I want you to pay attention to what kinds of peaceful forms of protest they engaged in. And typically, the peaceful forms of protest were the most effective. Okay, so you'll need to be able to categorize which ones were peaceful and which ones um, were violent or destructive. You'll need to categorize those types of resistance to these laws, and also be able to explain which ones were effective and why.
Colonists once again created non-importation. We're not going to buy any British goods and non-consumption agreements, and it really has a huge blow on British trade. Colonists are boycotting British goods. You have the Daughters of Liberty, a group made up of colonial women, organizing spinning bees where they would rather make their own clothes than purchase those sold by British merchants. And you have a whole variety of groups mobilizing, including women, artisans, laborers, and so on. Unfortunately for the British, England was losing more money than it was generating by these taxes because of all the colonial resistance, and as a result, rather than continue to lose money, the Townshend duties are repealed in 1770.
All right, now, so let me give you examples here of resistance. John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer, where he argued no taxation without representation, essentially saying we shouldn't have to pay a tax if we're not represented in Parliament. Is that a form of peaceful protest or a form of violent protest? Obviously, that's peaceful. Was it effective? Yes, it convinced people of an argument. Non-importation agreements and non-consumption agreements, where they boycott British goods. Is that peaceful or violent? Obviously, that's peaceful. What about when the Sons of Liberty are tarring and feathering tax collectors in colonies? Is that violence or is it peaceful? Obviously, that is violent protest. Or when we get to it, the Boston Tea Party, where colonists board these ships, these privately owned ships, and they take the tea and they dump it into the Boston Harbor. Is that violent or is it peaceful? That is violent because they're destroying property. Specifically in that case, they're destroying private property, not government property. So make sure that you can categorize these things and speak to their effectiveness. Also, notice that everything that England is passing, they eventually have to repeal because of the effectiveness of some of these protests.
England backs down again. Now, around this same time, tensions are really high. There's a lot of troops in the Boston area. An incident occurs in early 1770, and that is, of course, the Boston Massacre.
All right, so in Boston around 1770, you have a huge increase in British troops being sent to Boston, which is sort of considered to be the city where all of this resistance is really being born, where all of this all these unsettling activities are taking place. So that's why Britain is sending more and more troops into Boston. The more troops you have, the more unsettled the people are becoming.
What happens is British troops open fire near the customs house on a group of colonists. Some would call it a mob. And this event leads to the death of 5 colonists. Paul Revere uses this engraving you see right there as pro-colonial propaganda, kind of showing the British soldiers gunning down these innocent colonists. The reality was much more complicated. In fact, John Adams, one of the preeminent colonists at the time, second president of the United States, he actually defends the British soldiers against murder charges because he feels it's the right thing to do. Following this massacre, there is kind of a chill moment. No one wants people to die. There's no calls for independence at this point, so keep that in mind. You do have the colonists once again meeting again. And this is the Committees of Correspondence. They're led by Samuel Adams, another prominent colonist, and they're used to keep up communication and resistance amongst the colonists to British policies.
This is another form of protest, peaceful protest, where they're essentially just communicating with one another about British policies. I want to go back a little bit to the Boston Massacre. One of the things that was happening here is these colonists were throwing snowballs and rocks and other things at these soldiers, and these soldiers were outnumbered by a lot. So this painting, this engraving of created by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre, it kind of shows that the British just opened fire on a bunch of poor colonists who were just standing there innocently and ended up being shot. You can see the faces of the men who are representing the British. They've got these angry faces. These people look like they're terrified. Well, in reality, the mob started this. And these soldiers were just defending themselves. And that's pretty much the argument that John Adams used to defend these soldiers, and he won. He won. Also interesting to note that the first casualty, really, of the American Revolution was a black man named Crispus Attucks. He was shot in this incident. Let's go back.
And they're used to keep up communication and resistance amongst the colonists to British policies. This is another example, another movement towards intercolonial unity. They're exchanging letters, they're talking, but once again, no independence. From around 1770 to 1773, there's no real big protest going on, but that all changes with tea time. The Tea Act was passed in 1773 once again by Parliament, and it gave a monopoly to a British company, the British East India Company. The company was near bankruptcy, and Parliament kind of wanted to bail them out. In spite of the fact that the British tea was still cheaper than smuggled tea, the colonists were still opposed to it because the principle, they have not consented to be taxed. They still opposed the Tea Act, and once again, that idea that Parliament could tax the colonies was unfathomable for them. We all know how this story ends because in 1773 you have the event known famously as the Boston Tea Party. Members of the Sons of Liberty, some of them loosely dressed up as Native Americans, board some ships and dump tea into Boston Harbor. This event was not without controversy. Not only was the British East India Company, Parliament in England, and the Crown mad, but also some colonists resisted the action because this was a destruction of private property. And no, you don't do that. That was considered too radical by some, even in the colonies. As a result of the Boston Tea Party, England, Parliament passes the Coercive Acts in 1774.
All right, go back real quick. One of the things here, yes, tea is actually cheaper as a result of the Tea Act because it gives a monopoly to the British East India Company. So they're able to sell more tea, which means the price of tea will drop. So the price of tea drops, but the colonists are upset, not because of the tax itself, although the principle of Parliament being able to tax the colonies upset them. But they were also upset over this. The fact that the Tea Act gave a monopoly to the British East India Company. They didn't like that. They wanted the colonists, colonial tea companies to be able to compete, or they wanted to be able to get tea from other nations. But this act prevented those free market activities from taking place. So the colonists opposed the Tea Act because it precipitated the idea that Parliament could tax them, and it created a monopoly for the British East India Company. Then they board the Sons of Liberty board this ship and dump tea into the Boston Harbor, and a lot of colonists were upset by this because they were destroying private property, and they didn't think that was a good idea. If you're going to destroy property, it should be destruction of property against those who were responsible for the law that was being passed or being implemented, which would be the government. That's kind of the position that they took. Another thing that starts to happen here is as a result of this, colonists begin to turn away from tea and they start drinking coffee. So that's one reason why coffee today is a much more popular drink for Americans than tea is. This was kind of the time period when that shift took place.
And dump tea into, intended to punish the colonies. We're going to spank their butts. And they do a variety of things to accomplish this goal. Boston Port was closed until the property was paid for. In fact, you could see by 1775 where the British troops are being sent, and a huge amount of them are in the Boston area. That's where a lot of this early protest was taking place. It drastically reduced the power of the Massachusetts legislature, and it banned the town hall meetings, that kind of big democratic institution in the New England colonies. They are banned. The Quartering Act was expanded, so once again, more British troops are being sent over the colonies. The colonists were expected to provide for them. Royal officials accused of a crime would be put on trial in England rather than the colonies. And the colonists were outraged by this because they felt this would not ensure justice would be served. The colonists were outraged and called the coercive acts the Intolerable Acts. So if you see Intolerable Acts, coercive acts, they're the same thing. The colonists respond to the Intolerable Acts by a declaration known as the Suffolk Resolves. This was made by a county in Boston, and it called on the colonies to boycott British goods until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. So tensions are mounting again between England and the colonies.
All right, let's go back a little bit. Sorry about that. So the coercive acts are passed after the Boston Tea Party. It's literally punishment for the Boston Tea Party. The Boston port was closed. The power of the Massachusetts legislature is reduced dramatically. They ban town hall meetings. Quartering Act is expanded. Royal officials accused of a crime would be put on trial in England instead of the colonies. And the colonists called these acts the Intolerable Acts. So you need to know these acts by both names, coercive acts or intolerable acts. The Suffolk Resolves were put into place in order to boycott British goods until these intolerable acts were repealed.
To boycott British goods until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. So tensions are mounting again between England and the colonies. Now, something that has nothing at all to do with the colonies but yet stirs up trouble nonetheless is the Quebec Act in 1774. It's England trying to figure out what to do with the Canadian lands they acquired from France as a result of the 7 Years' War. There's something like 60,000 French subjects in Canada, and England needs to figure out what to do with them in the territory that they got. So here's what they do under the Quebec Act. It extended the boundary of Quebec into the
I'm going to let you just read about this. I'm going to let you just read about this, but here are some of the things that the Quebec Act did. I'm probably not going to ask you much about this because it's a smaller it's not as important of an issue as some of the other things. But just make sure that you read about it in your textbook. We'll skip ahead a little bit right here. First Continental Congress in response to the Intolerable Acts. Also, you need to be paying attention to the timeline. Make sure that you know kind of when things happen. I'm not going to ask you specific dates, but you will need to know like years in which things took place.
Meeting in 1774. All colonies except Georgia, they're too far, they're not interested, send representatives to meet in Philadelphia in September of 1774. You get a diverse group of people coming together. You got Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, John Adams, George Washington, and this is another example of colonial unity. This is largely made up of the colonial elites. They disagreed about things, but for the most part, they wanted to repair their relationship with England. They want to figure out how to respond to their perceived violations of their liberties, but they want to bring the relationship between the English and the colonies back to the way it was pre-1763.
All right, real quick. I want you to notice what's happening here. It's 1774, and we're getting close to the American Revolution really beginning with, violence and gunfire and armies pitted against each other. And they're still, look, the First Continental Congress was created to try to fix the relationship with England. So still, nobody is even really considering the idea that, hey, we need to break away from England. It's still all about how can we fix this situation? How can we mend these fences? How can we make the relationship that we have with Parliament and the King better? And most people are still in that camp. They're still not thinking necessarily revolution. Now, there are some people that are starting to move in that direction and starting to write about it and starting to vocalize that idea. But in general, most people are still in this camp. And that's the First Continental Congress. That's why it was formed.
It's important to note they're not calling for independence.
There you go.
This was not a movement towards independence, not yet. They adopted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, in which, once again, they talk about taxation without representation. They said, Parliament, you have the right to regulate commerce, but you can't be doing these other things. But King George dismisses these grievances. They endorsed the Suffolk Resolves. They created the Association, which sounds really official, to coordinate an economic boycott amongst the colonies. And they also start making military preparations. Remember, there's a lot of British soldiers, especially in the Boston area, so they're getting ready to defend themselves in case things get even worse.
All right, real quick. Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Endorsed the Suffolk Resolves. Created the association to essentially enforce these boycotts. And they start making military preparations. So they did a lot, but the number one goal was this. However, in doing this, they still have to look ahead and they still have to think about what may be coming down the road. So that's why they do this. They start making military preparations. It's important to look ahead, and that's what they're doing. They plan to meet again in May of 1775.
And finally, they plan to meet again in May of 1775. So what's the response of England? Well, King George III dismisses their grievances. He declares Massachusetts in rebellion, and more troops are sent to North America to try to get these colonists in check.
Wrong way to react, sending more troops as a result of this Congress meeting. He sends more troops into Boston.
And that leads us to the opening shots of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. The first fights of the American Revolution actually occur well over a year before independence is even declared. And here's the background. British troops led by General Gage leave Boston to seize colonial weapons and to try to arrest rebel leaders Sam Adams and John Hancock.
Okay, there's a lot of troops in Boston. They're leaving, being led by Gage, to try to get John Adams and John Hancock. You're going to have a weapons silo essentially over here that they're trying to get to.
As they're heading out of Boston, they head to a place called Lexington, and the Minutemen, which is what the colonial militia were called, they're warned by two individuals, Paul Revere and William Dawes, that the British are coming, and at Lexington, the shot heard round the world takes place as British soldiers kill 8 colonists in April of 1775. Now, once again, just like the Boston Massacre, no one really knows kind of all the details. There's the British side, there's the colonist side, and there's probably somewhere in the middle some truth there. But nonetheless, 8 colonists are killed. Once again, notice the date, April 1775. We will not declare independence until July of 1776. No one anticipated this fighting to occur at this moment, but it does. In fact, another battle took place at Concord as the British troops are marching back to Boston. They're attacked by colonial militia. They're shot at, and they're shocked because the colonial militia are fighting them and they're holding their ground. And we have the start of fighting of the American Revolution.
All right, real quick, these Minutemen probably did not say the British are coming because they were British, so they probably said the Redcoats are coming.